This is a staff meeting Thursday, March 30th. I didn't record the last one. I think.
You did.
I think it was the last one. Well, we've got a community guideline strike.
You did.
Okay.
What?
You did.
I did. The problem is they don't tell you, right? If they just said this is not okay, but it's like otherwise, like we talk for 2 hours. What the fuck is in here that's offensive? I don't know. It's weird what's getting banned lately. Some really stupid stuff is getting, and TikTok's getting the same way. It's like you stuff that makes absolutely no sense gets, for it to be banned, gets banned, and something that's so fucking awful it shouldn't be on there, it just keeps going. And it seems like it's just all political. Anyway. So any news happening this week? Anything fascinating you run into?
Just more of overall decline.
I've noticed that the information, like they've built up this whole industry of talking about the war in Ukraine, and there's nothing useful coming out of it. So the quality of fabrication and by exaggerating any minor thing as if it's meaningful has gone up, as to become sort of a clown world. The same thing with reading Chairman G's tea leaves, right? I mean, it's like, I don't, you guys probably don't know if you remember Kremlin. We used to call Kremlinology, which is the Kremlin was incredibly opaque, still is. It was incredibly opaque. So we had this enormous set of fortune tellers that said what was happening inside the Kremlin. And as soon as the Soviet Union fell, we had 500,000 people that were immediately unemployed because there was no more tea leaves to read. So they went around the world trying to find something else to talk about. I'm still kind of impressed at the way the public is sort of turning. It's a little harder to be, is it me, or is it a little harder to be woke these days? Because I mean, especially I love it. It's disaffected ugly white chicks. Is that really basically is it basically young white women that are making up the woke movement? I mean, are the comedians right that white women stole it from black folks?
Well, and various degenerates.
Yes.
It's becoming harder to make excuses for your degeneracy.
Yes.
Yes.
Nice note from Jordan Hall there, I saw, to you, Brandon. That was kind of interesting.
Yes.
He's such a good guy.
I keep track of collisions and people who are going to crash into us. I know who they are and where they are.
He's such a good guy.
Yes. There are many good people out there that are just trying to do the right thing, where I'm attempting to afford them the tools.
So that was that one. Brandon and I worked on the homepage, and of course, and then we've made a bunch of links and then broke them all. And but we figured out how to condense we don't need this intermediate page, which is a summary of our ideas anymore, because we just need a link from the homepage to those ideas. And so that's what we're doing. That's turning out to be pretty interesting. Last night, this morning, I'm working on bringing in some additional stuff into the section on man. That doesn't matter much. It's only that yeah, I don't want to get too detailed, but we've done some good work recently that needs to be brought in. And then that's mostly so, and I feel really good about the direction our overall branding is going by putting this information in the structure it's in. And hopefully Brandon and I will finish more of the content soon. As for finishing the book, if the Constitution is the primary deliverable, I'm not worried about that any longer. That's pretty easy. We can build out everything from there. So from those standpoints, I feel pretty good. From the standpoint of I've got to move somewhere, it's still making a fucking nightmare for me because I don't have any time frame for it. Anyway, aside from that, what else is going on in the news? Nothing much. I don't have a lot this week. Because I feel like I understand what's going on.
Well, Kurt, I remember in the chat you mentioned maybe a couple weeks ago that you were noticing a bit of a convergence on our messaging. I think you were referencing Lindsay and Scott Adams in particular. They were kind of mentioning the feminine elements at play. So I don't know if you wanted to touch on that convergence you were seeing.
Well, I think thanks for bringing it up. I think what's happened over the past 9 months, 8 months, maybe even 6 months, is that, I was really anxious about how do we go out with this message of really, it's just it's a normal progress of, we went through cultural integrations, right? The French Revolution, the German, the Russian, the Ashkenazi, 2 Ashkenazi revolutions, etc. We've integrated them into our we went through the British Revolution, the British Enlightenment, and then what the rest of the world calls the Enlightenment, but I call the Counter-Enlightenment, which is to counter reaction to it. And then we moved into, once we brought countries in, we moved classes in, right? We moved in the middle class, then the craftsman class, and the farmer class. Then we moved in the craftsman and laboring classes, and finally we moved women in. And every time we bring somebody in, they develop the same kind of counter reaction to modernity that every nation did before them and every class before them did. And so what we're just going through is in the current period, the cost of integrating women, which is the most divergent group so far, right? The most likely to defect group with the most divergent biases. Instead of being just class, their women are a very different class. We brought that in, and then we've also brought in Jewish intellectuals who pursue that class, right? That strategy. So they've provided an intellectual framework for it. So if we've brought all these things in and we're running this experiment of intolerance, frankly, like we ran every other experiment in tolerance, we should be seeing what we're seeing. So I was just worried about saying that, and like, how am we going to make that story? Because people are going to hate it. Well, if there's convergence coming along, then what's so funny, Brandon?
They're going to hate the convergence of like material things worse than they hate adapting to something
okay.
like in their mind.
In other words, they're going to hate the reality's punishment of them for their ideas more than
a lot worse. It's going to be so much worse.
So, but anyway,
they're still gonna blame us though.
Of course.
And we're gonna get blamed anyway, so
yes, of course. So in the end, though, I was worried, like, how are we going to go out with this message? But what's happening is the market is ripening, right? So that when we deliver the message, it's consistent with what others are hearing. So I think that's fine. I think that's that things are working in our nature, in our benefit. So,
well, Luke frames civilization as insulating people from nature. As you mature, we afford you to be in closer contact with nature. That's like violence. You don't raise children and women to places where there's violence. You protect them from that.
Yes.
And we keep ushering them in like their perception is needed there, and it's not.
Well, and if we talk about what it means to defect, right? What are we really saying? You know, in my framing, it's you're extracting or consuming the value produced by a commons faster than it can be produced, or in excess of what you can contribute to that
Right.
commons, which is what children do.
Mhm.
And that's why every group that comes in before they're integrated, we view them as children
Children, yes.
and always have. Right. So that's
We treat children better than other people. Better. We forbear for
Well,
them
okay,
more.
we treat them better.
We forbear for them more.
We forbear for them more. Yes, that's right.
And we don't give them authority to decide over us.
Yes, and that's there you go. You can't have, I don't know if authority is the right word, influence. You can't have influence without corresponding responsibility.
But that emerges naturally because they lack their proportionality for reciprocity with us. I mean, my kid can't strike me back. You just can't do it. So we use groups of us to pressure others into optimal relations with everyone.
Mhm.
So we are moving into a place where if you hit a child, there will be an agency that shows up and takes you from your home to protect your children. But there's a super fine line where you want to deal with the closest node of power. You want to push that power down as far as you can so that an adult can discipline a child that is his or hers in the manner they see fit, because they are going to steward optimal relation with their family first,
Well,
then
there's
with the community, and so on.
defining that line is a great question for law, because it's actually definable.
Correct.
And the answer is all of us can recognize it, but how do we codify it? I mean, the problem. So you know, we have this thing about not spanking. Well, I don't know how I feel about it. I don't particularly care, right? I'm not. I can listen to all the psychologists, but I'm not sure that the consequence that they're talking about for the child as an individual plays out in the society as positive. In other words, it may seem to play out psychologically positively for the child, but I'm not sure it plays out socially as it between adults. And I'm not advocating that. I'm just I'm saying that I'm not sure, right? So this is one of those things where I don't know. However, child abuse is really simple, right? I mean, there's discipline. There's, and it's called, and it's just like the law, right? There's who did this? Is it a harm of intent or failure of due diligence? How do we perform restitution, usually in the form of apology? How do we perform prevention, usually in terms of punishment? And how do we prevent imitation or replication, right? Which is expansion of imitation of it by others. Well, I mean, look at are you actually doing that, or just torturing the fucking child, right? I mean, you know, my father was terribly jealous of me, in particular, of the kids in general, and he was pretty horrible because of it. I have another friend who's in the same position, where's the other parent, and you know, the kids are like, well, I'm not doing anything, right? The kid's confused, right? I mean, of course, at some point the kid says, this is unjust, and the kids be acting out because of injustice. I mean, because we know what injustice is, even after a while, it isn't hard to know that there's no relationship here. So how do we codify this? I think this is an excellent job for us to, one of the pieces we can disambiguate and turn into a system of measurement, because, you know, I mean, if you see I remember there's a great video of this Black woman who's got her like 6-year-old, and she can't control him in the store. Right. And she's like, and she's like, He's like, you have to take him out of here. He says, you don't understand. You won't let me discipline him. If I discipline him, you'll throw me out. If I discipline him, but not physically, which I have to because he's strong and he's aggressive, then he'll be taken away from me. So I'm stuck here and I can't do anything except have this fucking kid be a terrorist. And she's just being honest with the store manager. And I'm like, that is testimony. And so it depends on the kid. I mean, we know Asian kids are pretty pliable. We know white kids are slightly less pliable. We know mixed kids are slightly less pliable. We know different groups of Africans are not pliable at all, right? They need strong correction. You actually see this in civilizations. How do Africans discipline their own versus mixed people like Hispanics mix their own? How do how do Africans do it? How do people in the Arab world do it? How do his mixed groups like how do it? How do Europeans do it? And how do Asians do it? Well, the difference is there's a declining scale of violence from Asian down to declining from African down to Asian. Why? Because that's all it takes. Right. But if you look how Africans take care of each other, they beat the heck out of each other. Right. Why? Because neoteny. Yeah, they're just more sexually developed, so they're more aggressive. And then, frankly, they're more hardy. Why do you think Europeans used them as slaves? Does anything I'm saying sound offensive? Because if it is, I sometimes don't know when the truth is that I'm using in order to try to make people get along and help each other is truth that is somehow
It's always
offensive. What?
It's always worse. I mean, you made it about race, but we can just make it about women. It's like we used to abuse children,
Yep.
from the masculine, right? And the
Yes.
feminine had to step in. Well, now they're being abused by the feminine. It's worse,
Yeah.
way worse.
Well, I mean, you've made this point before because you've spent time training animals, right, and people.
Mhm.
No difference.
There's no difference, and it's so true. The more I think about it, the more painful it is. It's almost like we need to have a mandatory dog training courses before you can have human training courses, so you're dispelled of the delusion. Right? It's like everybody should wait tables, so you're dispelled of the delusion of the common man.
The difference is that dogs don't make excuses.
Yes, that's true.
They do not.
But anyway, you made this point, Brandon, that the way we used to train horses, because that's something I understand. The way we used to train horses 100 years ago is very different from the way we train horses today. It turns out the horses want to fucking make you happy, right? They gotta trust you. So you can't treat them like a machine, right? The horse wants to make you happy anyway, so just make friends with it. It takes a little longer, but well, the same thing turns out with dogs, right? I mean, you don't have to treat them brutally, right? You can just make friends with the dog and we'll go on. Well, the same thing with children, as it turns out we can do that. The difference is that scale from human to dog to horse is a pretty good climb, right? The horse is essentially a hyper impulsive toddler prey animal, right? Right. It thinks it's 1,500 pounds. It thinks it's a bunny rabbit, right? Which is just I never can get over that. But women totally get it. They're just toddlers, right? And then you get the dog, right? And it's like, well, they're pretty much halfway human, a dog, right? I mean, their social structure is very similar to ours, but they've got instincts and impulses, right? And they want to do things. Well, humans, we got a little more agency than dogs, but we still have our instincts and impulses, right? I mean, and that climb is pretty obvious. So how did I get on this thread? I was trying to make a fucking point here and I've lost it because I was so fascinated by this climb.
Is it proportionality? Is that
right? Thank you. So are you providing So we don't have to provide the punishment we do, but the difference is you have to provide the skills to the trainer that we may not have.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's fundamentally true.
Yeah.
So can you get a class in parenting? And if you did, right? If you did have a class in parenting, who would agree with it and who would disagree? Now you talk about you have a African American, a West African, a boy who's West African descent, who's 5 years old, and has that, and he's going to have perspiration and beginning sexual development in a year, right? So that dominance and expression is starting to come out. But where did we get that? You know, most of us white folk, we get that 13, you know, after 11, 13, 14, 15. Well, how much more agency do we have in 13, 14, 15 than we have at 6, 7, and 8? Right? And so you need a different parenting model, just like you need a different education model. And I'm using this example. I could have used it instead of white folk, I could have used it as Asians. Right? I mean, which, you know, they're like, I mean, my kid is a Germanic white, you know, blonde Germanic white kid, right? And he's in the 99th percentile of size, and he's got an orderly sensibility. And if you're misbehaving, he's going to discipline you, right? So of course, the Asian kids don't need disciplining, but the other kids in the classes get out of line. He's going to do it. Well, the Asian kids will just put up with it. But what happens when the black kids do it? Well, the black kids are getting the dominance expression or reaction more heavily. Plus, they feel they're at the bottom of the totem pole anyway. So, I mean, why do we have this myth that parenting isn't a science, so to speak, or at least a craft like everything else? And I'm talking about this long enough with enough dimensions so that I can hopefully get some interesting insight out of the wisdom here. But
well, I've certainly noticed that whenever someone advocates for no spanking, it's some middle class white parents that universalizes their experience.
Right.
Whose children are becoming less in need of spanking as the feminization pushes on, because they're more pliable, more agreeable. They create aggressive behaviors, but the genetic pull is towards more pliable people. You create more dysfunction, but the people are more pliable.
Well, I mean, but you know, let's go back to it. So a dominance expression, aggression, right? These are resources. It's like saying, like Luke starts out with, violence is a resource. It can be put to good or ill. Am I quoting you correctly, Luke? Or
yeah, that's accurate.
Okay. You know, it's just a resource. We can't look at what we call tolerance and forbearance, right? That's a resource. It can be put to good or ill. Well, it's the same thing in in this case. I think I lost my point again. There's no caffeine in here.
But the story about the woman in the store with the 6-year-old, right? I view that as over 2,000 days of failure that led to that incident. That's not a single incident that occurred.
Right, but she's afraid to parent her kid.
No,
And
she
it's
failed to parent her
because
kid and put herself in that position.
Well, yeah, no, but the standard. Hold on, yeah, I'm trying to be more. I know you're right, but I'm trying to blame it. I'm trying to say who's responsible here? The person with the 85 IQ that's trying to raise a kid, or those of us who know better, who should possibly be training these people so they can produce high investment children. And then how should we say, well, like Martin just said, yeah, you're a middle-class white woman and your kids, you know, been the subject of genetic pacification, which is a nice word for eugenics, for the past 2,000 years. And of course, your kid's more peaceful than this other kid who hasn't been, right? Whose genes haven't been. So now you think you're the standard of weight and measure. The point is, there's no universal standard of weight and measure, right? In how to train a human being, right? There's just, because there's a spectrum of us, right? Which is really pliable to less, meaning maturing least and slowest and having the longest lifespan, Asians, and maturing fastest and deepest and having the shortest lifespan, Africans. And the humans are along this spectrum. So, I mean, it's pretty easy to look at the data and understand what's going on. So why are we telling Black women that they can't physically discipline kids that need to be physically disciplined because they're in a stage of physical expression of their development? Does that make sense what I said or no?
Yes.
Luke, I'm asking Luke.
I understand what you're saying. I don't agree with it.
Okay,
Because
that's
they
what I
failed-
want.
It's
Well,
because
well,
they failed to create a foundation of discipline prior to that.
right. I'm saying that you're right, or you're just leaping ahead. So you're saying, wow, we can create a foundation for discipline for it. How does that parent know what to do? Where did we learn parenting?
By integrating with the rest of society that's doing it.
Okay, well, okay. That's assuming you're in a group that whose concept of integration is the one you're talking about.
That's
Right?
been taken away from everybody.
But that's been taken away from them.
Right.
Right? They're no longer live in that circumstance. So my argument is we shouldn't expect people to have the trait of parenting. Hell, we're getting to the point where we shouldn't expect people to have the trait of friendship, for Christ's sake. They certainly can't demonstrate the trait of marriageability. So, I mean, if we're desocializing people across this spectrum, how do we restore that? And I guess my argument is, well, I mean, why don't we just teach it? I mean, I always say my favorite class in high school was marriage and family. It was fantastic. Yes, I still plowed through 3 wives, but I would have been worse if I hadn't had it. Sorry. I'll shut up now. Trying to get this conversation going, and I'm failing.
I agree with you. We shouldn't expect it. I don't expect adulthood out of most people. Doesn't mean they're not responsible for being adults. I understand it. They may not have caused the failure. It's still their responsibility to accommodate and account for that failure.
I know, but that's like, again, that's why am I the liberal in this group? This is so fucking weird to me.
I don't see you as that. Oh, firstly, the situation is real. Well, we should afford that woman to take responsibility for her child. I mean, there shouldn't be an agency that takes her children away if she disciplines the child in the fashion that it needs to be disciplined in the moment it needs that discipline in order to create harmony with the situation. That's hardly difficult to solve. Yet we have government agencies that overreach into people's lives all the time for no reason other than to perpetuate themselves and harm those families.
So we have people that go and they go into people's houses and they teach them how to take care of pets.
Oh, I did that.
Just why don't we have this? But what they do with the dogs is cognitive behavioral therapy.
Yes.
It's
Well, I
performative.
always found a very hard dog or very broken people.
Yes.
That's it. Those are the 2 things that you find when you have to go to people's homes to deal with a cooperative problem with a dog. Right? It's highly and hyper adaptable.
Right. But the people that are going in are not doing that. They're doing talk therapy.
Yes.
And that we know talk therapy doesn't work.
Correct.
We know cognitive behavioral therapy works.
Mhm.
So there's no reason there aren't classes in this, and there's no reason we don't teach cognitive behavioral therapy to go help people with children the way they have people with pets, instead of putting these people who are already under duress into more duress by the fear that their children are going to take. Now, if you're a crack whore, I mean, I don't know any of these, but I'm using the example. I couldn't think of any joke to make there. Sorry, it just fell flat. But if you're a crack whore, I completely get it. I also get that if you've ever met somebody with a 70 IQ, how that person can be overloaded by children. I mean, just planning a regular schedule for a day is actually really hard. Well, that didn't matter when there's 3 generations of women around, each of which has their children. But that matters a lot because that solves the problem Luke was talking about, which is conformity through social pressure. But when we don't have that conformity through social pressure, it increases the burden of cognitive behavioral therapy, of training on the parent. And so we've put a whole bunch of people into absolute nuclear families or single motherhoods without chains of relatives to share the burden on it. And they lack the skill and sometimes the ability to apply the skill to parent people, to parent children. And
We also take the kids out of the house at 4 and 5 years old, and then the older kids have zero exposure to how to raise children.
That's right.
We've outsourced the operation of family to the government.
One thing along those lines is that we have these people talking all this smack about the wonders of urbanization, and you have those economists are talking about this, and these city people talking about it. Except what happens in a city is that you trade reproduction for consumption. Well, that sounds really good, except you've raised the price of children really, really high. Now, if there's no social conformity and there's high mobility, now your kids aren't safe to go outside. I mean, this whole sequence of things that will get people to the point where the kids aren't being able to make use of social environmental pressures. If they're in school, the school isn't providing the social environmental pressure anymore because the teachers are prohibited from disciplining and conformity. And then at home, there's no parent at home. No wonder why these kids are growing up with no responsibility, because no one's demonstrated responsibility. And that's my take, right? Is that if no one's demonstrating responsibility for you, why should you demonstrate responsibility for everyone else? Because everyone you interact with, from your parents to your teachers to your schoolmates to their parents, and frankly to the political system, to the society we live in, nobody's demonstrating responsibility. And when responsibility is demonstrated, we try to do it by one norm or another, and the norm that's necessary for kids that mature at 7 is different from the norms of children that mature at 17. If I made my point here, or have I not made my point? Because I'm not generating much conversation. Okay,
I'm under the impression if you make a good point that there isn't a conversation to be had, right?
Okay. Well, usually, the whole point is to be wrong about something. So, like, I gotta be like Luke's point. I was like Luke was saying, well, I disagree. Well, that's good, but now there's a point of talking, right?
Well, and I would suggest that the norms aren't different. The dosage is different. When they mature that much faster, you have that less amount of time for error, to correct for error. So you have to be spot on from the beginning, but it's the same norms.
I don't understand. I mean, I'm sure that you have that makes sense. I just don't understand what you're saying.
Luke, you're trying to optimize for as little force as necessary in training the child, yes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. So
so you're say that again, Luke. So you're saying the parents don't have the time?
Yeah, what you're saying is that because they reach maturity so much faster, right? That we have to change how we engage with them. We just can't make mistakes in that process if they're maturing that much faster.
Well, who's maturing that much faster?
The child, right? You're saying they're maturing by 7 or 8.
Right, so that's Africans versus Asians, right? I mean, that's a long
and what I'm suggesting is, if it wasn't humans, if it was any other creature, and we were in that same position, we would be training them the same way. We would just be changing the dosage, the amount of training.
Yes. Okay. great. Yes.
It'd be the same type of training.
Yes.
Absolutely. We don't change the norms. We change the exposure. We change the dosage.
I think we're just using a different definition of norm.
I still don't think it would be the same, because there are inherent differences in intelligence and impulse control, and you can get away with raising Asian kid or white kid sometimes just by explaining the stuff to them.
I know that's true, but that doesn't mean that just means it requires more repetition of something. And the reason I say that is, if you look at religious Black families in the South, it works. right? So it clearly can work. And so if it can and does work, if the church if religion is no longer a means of doing so, how can it work? Well, I mean, these are intensely, I mean, if you look at the spread of Christianity in Africa, it's actually Los Angeles evangelicalism. It's like talking in tongues, right? This religion that is spreading in Africa was invented in America in the 60s. And that's what spread to Africa through evangelicals. And it's the whole shaking your arms and, you know, it's very emotional and social. Whereas if you look at our Christian religion in Germanic Europe, it's a little more like obeying commands at the marching parade. Stand up, sit, you know, flip your gun, sword around. I mean, say your oath. I mean, it's very ritualized, but it's not very passionate. One of the reasons my mother liked the Catholic Church is because they sang a lot in her church, right? Right. So that made it emotional. But we don't have those institutions anymore. So it just, you know, what it appears to be is that some of us need what's called a cross-dimensional reinforcement. So if you talk to someone like my sister who's studied this quite a bit, she'll say, well, you know, if you just make a kid sit there and recite something, it's different from if you make a kid recite something and move, right? Use it with motions. It's different from if you have all the kids recite something in the motions. And the amplitude of that reinforcement is an order. In other words, it's an order of magnitude different with each of those steps. So like I could read something on my own. I could read something and then recite it to you. I could recite it as a play. A play is a good example, right? Or just as a ritual, just as, you know, what's that Simon Says? It doesn't matter. It's that, you know, and then you can recite it as a ritual with others. And then you can recite it with a lot of people. I mean, every time you do that, the reinforcement is more powerful. Well, some of us need that more powerful reinforcement. Does that make sense?
They need to play earlier and more often.
Okay, correct. Yes.
And you can make the world play for them. We know how fast they mature.
Yes.
This is not a mystery.
Well, it's the same thing for why do we make kids sit there working from books, which is a really primitive technology, when we know how fast they learn from fucking games. I mean, you can teach a kid anything in a goddamn video game. It's unbelievable. And they learn at their own pace, and there's a continuous positive reward system in it. Right? And I still am thrilled by this.
You can mimic without internalizing concepts, but you can't express without internalizing concepts. So
say that again.
So you can mimic without internalizing concepts, but you cannot express without internalizing concepts. You can't summarize and restate, right? And that's what play is. That's what game is. That's what expression is. It's that process in a context that's accessible to the kids, right? One of the other things that just comes out in Brandon, that you may be more familiar with this than even I am, but it's been my experience that the people that have the larger dogs do a far better job of training them than the people that have the smaller dogs.
Oh, yeah.
People who come from horses, they do better with their dogs too.
Right.
Yeah.
The consequences are more readily apparent if you're failing, right? Well, what the
Are you saying you were a terror in your house, Luke?
That with that same thing, right? Was that anytime we bring a dog into the house, my children want to interact with that dog, with that puppy, like it's a stuffed animal. I need to interact with that dog like it's a dog, even though it's a puppy. It's still I have to interact with it like it's a dog. We do that same thing with kids. We don't interact with them like they're humans. We interact with them like they're these little strange alternate creature that doesn't exist as a human. So we don't start providing structure until we start seeing consequence.
Yeah, that's a great frame. And it's too late.
That's where we introduce the mistake, is we aren't interacting with them like they're humans in the process of development.
Yes.
Okay, so we're a group of people who have a long time preference, right?
That's right.
Now, would you say that we're a group of people that can handle stress fairly well compared to others? Martin?
Yes.
Yes. So try to, and we're also not exactly average intelligence, right? I mean, it's not we have the benefit of somewhere on the masculine scale, somewhere above average intelligence, somewhat almost exclusive systematizing, and really low, at least most of us, fairly low agreeableness. I don't trust Martin's if he says he has high agreeableness. He said, I don't believe it. I'm teasing you.
Well, I mean politeness.
What?
I mean politeness.
Politeness you have, but that doesn't. So you can be disagreeable and polite, right? I'm the same. I'm very polite, but in most times, but I have no desire to be agreeable. So go ahead. Somebody say something. So the problem, I'm really having trouble with my chain holding my content.
You were complimenting us in a chain of compliments. You lost your place, but you were going to go on.
All right, so we're a bunch of people who have a particular ability that is right. So, but what if you're like a person who's like, I mean, a 95 IQ person? That's the chick that it files paperwork at your doctor's office, right? Or what if you're a 90 IQ person? That's your cashier, your supermarket, right? What if you're one of those people? Now, how much, right? Now, the minute you get down below that, you're into the 85 range. Now, that person is barely, that's at the limit of the ability to learn much, right? That's, and self-manage. Now, what happens if you have a child that you can barely manage yourself, right? Without an extended family to help you. And now you've got a child. That person's under every stress imaginable, social, monetary, survival, right? That person's under extreme stress. So how does that person have the ability to use extra patience necessary for a child who requires extra patience? And so it used to be that you would have these things would be handled by extended families. Because as you get older, it's not just that your patience increases, it's that your ambition to be impatient decreases, right? As you get older. So you can have your grandmother or whatever talk to the kid calmly and whatever, because that's where they are in life. So what I'm trying to get at is it reasonable to expect people to be able to be good parents if they're in this condition without the training? And my view is that even if they have training, it's still
They still need the comments.
They still need it.
You need them. There's no substitute for them.
Right, and this is where I get where I think that one of the insight, I can't remember who said, what author said this, but we tend to think of society as polity. That's not true. There is a political system. That's for adults. Society is for making children. And the commons is largely for the purpose of making children. We don't need a commons for adults. We can live in our rabbit warren houses, consume our stuff by direct delivery, right? But we need a commons for children for specifically this reason. I'm watching Luke's face go, and I'm trying to think, okay, what the fuck is this guy thinking that it's going to blow a hole in my story? But so my point is that you need children make society, because society is necessary for children. So we need this reinforcement. So my argument is we can't expect everybody to be as agentful as we are.
No.
Anyway, Luke, go ahead.
Oh no, it's just what you're describing. So the comments and the things that it produces, right? I describe that as intergenerational value in all its forms, right? Not just financial value, but the norms, the people, the children themselves are all part of that intergenerational value that gets produced by commons, right?
Cultural and civilizational capital. Yeah.
Yes, all of that. Yeah. And that's why that's why I push back sometimes when we're talking about defection, is because anything that is extracting from that commons or consuming that commons faster than can be produced is defection. So it's not exclusively a female thing or anything like that. I mean, any of the for as long as people have been people, any trade that's being subsidized by consumption of the commons is defection, and that's male defection.
Sure.
Right. If I'm extracting intergenerational value to subsidize my profits, like I'm selling the local church for profit, right? Then I am defecting from that commons, from
Absolutely.
that people, right? And that's been going on for as long as we've been involved in
very common
international trade, right? That's the norm now. That's the whole model now. So that's the reason why I have a hard time saying that the introduction of women to the polity is causing all this, because it's not. We've been doing this forever. We've been selling our commons.
Yeah, that's
generation.
different from, okay. That's, so, I mean, I'm just gonna call you, that's a false equivalency. Yeah, absolutely, we've been doing that forever. We've also suppressed an awful lot of male behavior like that, right? We haven't suppressed that form of male behavior. And the reason we haven't is because this free trade thing doesn't do full accounting like we do, right?
Right.
That's right.
Yeah.
The problem with that is that as long as behavioral and genetic capital exists, physical capital can be reconstructed. The problem is recreating behavioral and genetic capital is way harder than creating physical capital. And you have to create the behavioral capital to create the physical capital, because in order to create physical capital, mostly what you're doing is delaying gratification, suppressing your reciprocity. And then furthermore, you've got to do that enough to produce enough surplus to be able to create commons. So my blaming of women for the increase that has led to the crisis is just to say that we've allowed women to vote in female preferences that have made it even worse. So if you say, well, I mean, the difference is we have a long history of suppressing irreciprocities by material means, which is what you're talking about. And we have a long history of suppressing fraud. The problem is we don't have a long history of suppressing social construction. And social construction is just a very advanced means of fraud that wasn't really possible until women became the target of voting academy and media, because more of them will defect than men will defect. And I that's just, you can't get out of that in the data, that the reason, if you look at the data, white men would never be a liberal anything. It's white women that drive the market from a bias toward the white male to a bias toward the white female. And the bias toward the white female is what's bringing in the compassion, right? Which is the permission to steal from the commons. And I don't mean just the material commons, but I mean the what you call the intergenerational value, or I would call the common capital.
Yes.
Am I wrong in that statement?
I absolutely agree. I believe that they're an accelerant. Absolutely.
Okay. That's when I say
accelerate a fire that doesn't exist.
Well,
so you can't accelerate a fire that doesn't exist. So,
well, I mean, the thing is, our law in the past would ban, you could fight we could fight a duel. We could go to court.
Right.
And there were terms of the duel as you had to be relative equals, right? You can't duel against your peasant, right? I mean, you have to. So, but at least
there's proportionality in it.
It was proportionality, exactly. Thank you. And you could go to court. But if you engaged in reputation destruction, that's allowed you to have the duel, or allowed you to take it to court. So reputation destruction was illegal. Now, what happened was they made this free speech law, which got out of hand due to the press. In other words, that we allowed the press leniency, right, to engage in character assassination. And we said specifically that people who have political power aren't insulated from character assassination. Well, you know, there's perhaps a legitimate case for making sure that people who have political power, right, they aren't character assassinated. We don't, in other words, they aren't of low character, I guess, right? I mean, there's something there, but it has to be true. But they didn't say it has to be true. They has to be true and it has to cause harm. Well, how does but the harm they stated had to be physical. That's where they broke it, because it's no longer informational capital they're guarding, or knowledge capital, or memory capital. It's actually their reputations. It's just whether the reputation and the laws. Whereas, so they screwed that up with the law. And then what happened is that opened the door for all this nonsense to come in. And unfortunately, though they still ridicule it, the McCarthy era failed. And it's because he got too overzealous about a point problem instead of a general problem. So, I mean, we're still in this phase of the female method of reputation destruction by social construction, which by pretense of moral virtue, which is really the female desire to not pay the cost of responsibility for prohibiting consumption of commons because they themselves want to consume the commons. That's what's driving all this behavior. So we just never had the ability in the past for women to get away with this, because frankly, you'd get your husband killed for it, or your brothers, or your dad, if you got out of hand. So we had, our law said there's no shrilling, right? You can't go around. You can't even go around being a Karen. It was illegal to be a Karen. So I'm saying, well, it worked in the past. Let's just restore the law in the future. And why? Because we developed the ability of males to express themselves through commercial theft, which is what Luke was bringing up earlier, or public theft, faster and suppress that than we did the social matter. And it's just logical that we did that. So I'm sorry, Luke, if I'm overplaying this, but if there's any lack of clarity in the audience either, I think we should address it, because I'm not saying, well, it's just women. I mean, certainly men doing this shit, but women provided the democratic base to allow it to be implemented. That's all. Now you can beat me up now. I'm waiting for the counterpunch.
No, I agree with you completely. We did a far better job of suppressing that kind of undermining in the past.
You know what it is, Luke? Maybe it's also, I tend to think in a lot, the first principles, right? So I think of these first principles.
Right.
And so I'm just building up everything. And when I say female, it's the feminine mind, right?
Right. Yeah, I get that.
Right. I know, but does the audience get that? I don't fucking know.
And I'm looking at it from the standpoint of, we use the term responsibility in relationship to the commons frequently, right? So it's
Yes.
both masculine and feminine that are avoiding responsibility are trying to off-put their risk onto the commons. The masculine is off-putting the risk of production onto the commons. The feminine is off-putting the risk of consumption onto the commons.
Yes.
And both of those things are occurring right now,
Yes.
today. We're not going to be able to fix it by just fixing one of those.
No, not at all. So
Yeah,
are you telling me
full accounting addresses both of those? So
well,
I continue to believe it's an issue of full accounting in
Right.
our norms. So
okay, so now are you? Let's
I'd
just
go further to say that we should address the men first,
right, me too.
because the women would follow.
I need to stop that method of lying, Abrahamic method of lying, which is the unification of European masculine systematizing with Semitic feminine mythology, magical thinking. I need to be able to put that in the law, right? Now, are you saying I don't need to explain our current condition as the post-war integration of women and Jewish?
I'm suggesting your explanation doesn't go far enough. I'm suggesting that the Abrahamic method is the displacement of risk onto the commons. That's the entire method. Doesn't matter if it's masculine or feminine. That's the method, is the displacement of risk onto the commons. They've been doing it in mercantilism for generations and generations. They're doing it with feminism now.
Very smart. You say smart things now and then, Luke.
And I just don't want to miss a vulnerability in our explanation and in our correction. It's an ideology designed to place risk onto the commons.
Yes, but why does it take root in women and it takes so less root in men?
Because we
Women
forbear
use-
against our women far more than we forbear against men. So it's a much easier vector.
They also use access to
There
opportunity,
we go.
a virtue signal.
Say that again.
Their status is tied to access to opportunity, where men's status is in creation of opportunity.
Yeah.
So give them access, then.
And we're also saying shift to children now instead of women, right? And like you said before, we build commons for children.
That's right.
But if they go right to the source, that's the easiest method to exploit it. That's the easiest vulnerability to exploit.
We have feminine minds, consuming the commons that children should be afforded to consume.
Yeah,
You were going to say something.
I think Luke hit I'm trying to rewind my brain and test this, but if we take full accounting as the problem, that neutralizes the emphasis.
One of the main features of these Abrahamic ideologies is that it conveys pretense of virtue without any corresponding responsibility.
Yes.
Yes.
Which is very attractive to female minds, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely leveraging all of those features, inherent features, but it's the externalization of the cost of risk onto the commons is the whole. Whether it's cost, risk involved in production or risk involved in consumption, it's still the externalization of the risks involved, or the displacement of responsibility, right, onto the commons.
And the European men simply aren't that sensitive to it because they're systematized and think through consequences of that ideology.
Right.
Just smell something is wrong there.
Right.
Well, Martin said it earlier, we're going to be held accountable anyway, right? If there's stuff to take back and redistribute, someone's got the stuff. It's our people. So
I guess I'm getting at is the problem's bigger than we've been stating, articulating. So
I just really like framing it as if we take we are in this crisis. If we take a full accounting, this is the spectrum of problems. I can say one of the problems is this particular method of deception. And so what we're trying to do is getting up this deception. Then I only have to say, well, it's normal that women would be more attracted to this deception than men.
We need them to be in order to raise our children correctly.
Right. And so that changes the argument a little bit. So that gets back to the reason we started this conversation, which is was really just, I'm like, I don't want to come out and blame women and Jews for something and then have the fucking, all the work we've done be canceled. Even though it's true. I mean, it's like, well,
because it's accountability, not responsibility. Because we are judges that we go, all right, well, this needs to be redistributed. You can only redistribute from the accountable. I can't take some dysfunctional person who caused harm and redistribute their nothing. They have nothing to redistribute.
Can I just interject something?
Yeah.
Because I've been trying to make and Brandon called me out on this the other day, trying to make the case that we're not aware of how much more sophisticated we are than we've got it. So, we don't realize what we know anymore, right? I mean, it's almost unfair because here I'm listening to this conversation. Do you know this is exactly what it sounds like when the Supreme Court judges get together and they discuss a case? It's exactly the same logic. They just don't have as granular a logic as we do. But we're doing exactly the same process.
And we also don't have, so that's what's her name, Jumanji.
Which means there's far less actual talking required.
You know, it's kind of interesting. It's like if you had a woman,
She isn't required to talk.
if
She
we
just
had a
does.
woman in here in this group right now, I would have a very difficult time speaking as truthfully on the way through the inquiry. In other words, this conversation would be difficult because I'd be worried about offending her the whole time. Which is, and why would I be? But I would be. And but then I would have no problem taking her the women's perception into account after we had thought the process through. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So that's the problem of integrating women into most intellectual discourse that in my lifetime. It's largely my lifetime is usually in things that are, you know, they're not of this magnitude, but they're usually in business or brand building or market issues or some sort of political question. Is that you have to pander to them during when we're making sausage, right? Instead of saying, okay, we've examined all the sausage that can be made. Some of it's fucking horrible to look at, right? And it's offensive, but we don't care because we're going to look at it anyway and try to figure out what the truth is. But then when we get to the end, I have no problem saying, okay, well, you know, let's get the women and see how they react to this. It's the process of you can't even talk about stuff, which is, I think, my complaint, Musk's complaint, even Scott Adams' complaint. I think most of our complaint about this attempt to silence discourse is that you can't even have the discussion any longer. I'm not going to insert something will get me this one community strike canceled, but it's such an opportunity to.
Well, you missed a prime dick pic joke back with the sausage making stuff. So
yes, okay, all right. So the problem is why is it cultural or is it instinctual that we defer to women? Now Luke touched on this a minute ago, but is it cultural or is it because it seems like men all around the world do it? I mean, men always separate from women to have serious conversations. And I'm not sure it's because we don't want, I think it's because we don't want to think through the problem in front of women. Is that true? Rather than we're happy once we thought through the problem, it's okay to talk to the women about what survives. Is that true?
Well, historical norm was that if women were present, then it wouldn't get involved in the discussion.
Yes.
Now they're told that their opinion is valid.
Well, I think there's a difference between true and desirable, right? And so the problem you have is that women generally are talking about what's desirable. In other words, they're predicting emotions or minds, and we're predicting systems or outcomes. Both positions are valuable, right? But I mean, I don't find the value in when you're trying to search for the truth, going through the things that are horrible is sometimes necessary. I know I've had this discussion with people in the past when talking about, well, how did you come up with this big strategy? So, well, I just don't do what you do, which is I think about all the evil things too. I just
You fully account.
What?
You fully account.
I fully account for the evil things too. And then part of that why I see what the other people might do, right? So what we might do, right? So I say, well, but I'm not an evil person. I'm not going to do that, right? But I fully accounted for it. But if I start talking about the evil things in front of people, they get scared.
they don't want you to have the capacity for it.
What?
They don't want you to have the capacity for it, especially.
Well, they don't mind if someone has the capacity for it. They just don't want to see it. So it's not just true of women, right? I can get a bunch of men in the room and talk about how to conduct. I mean, you can do it with war. You can do it with business and finance. You certainly do it with finance. because nobody understands what the fuck's going on. You can talk about it with business, sure. But I mean, if I used to have conversations with Jim, I would never let anybody else in, my partner Jim, because we could talk about things, and I'm like, well, we could do this. Is like, we can't do that because people hate us if we do that, right? So, you go through
I've never seen a group of people change their mind when given the evidence to change it faster than the group of people we deal with. They adapt to what's real, because it's real, because they have to, regardless of how they feel about it.
have to, or because we're actually responsible.
Because we will be held accountable.
By what?
Reality.
Exactly.
Ourselves.
Which means we're being responsible.
Our peers. I'm going to hold you accountable.
What?
Our peers. We should hold each other accountable.
Yeah.
This process, this kind of discussion, this process is inherently destructive. We separate this process out from the commons until we figure out what kind of destruction it's going to cause, and then we take the output back to the commons.
Yes.
It's like being in touch with nature.
So it's sort of like what we're doing. We have these discussions, right? But and the courts have these discussions, and generals have these discussions, right? And certainly the business leaders like me, we've had those discussions. So we go down these questions, and you just talk about all the answers, and you just weigh them neutrally, and then you see, okay, well, and this is what I talk about a field. You make a field of predictions, right? You account for everything, you full accounting of everything, and you say, okay, well, we don't really this is a really fucking bad idea. And these are some pretty good ideas, but we can't really bet on one. So there's like 5 here that might be okay. What policies do these 5 things have in common?
Right. Yes.
Right. And so you say, I'm going to act on the things that these 5 have in common. I'm not going to try to bring one of them to fruition. I'm going to move anything that moves all 5 of these things together.
Yeah.
I'm going to move forward. And so that's how you think with full accounting. Now, of course, the simple person says, I want this perfect solution right now, this fast. And of course, that's why they fucking fail all the time.
Yes.
Because they put all their energy into one thing and it fails. So, I mean, I'm glad you nodded that and supported that, Luke, because that's just such a hard lesson to get people across is what is it? Well, we push back on them. Well, Kurt, you need a lot of knowledge to be able to know what that field is. I'm like, exactly. Right. So that's why knowledge is valuable. That's why you don't want to count on yourself being the font of all wisdom. And then the other thing is you don't want to go into research any problem and think the first solution you come across is the fucking answer. It's the opposite.
You only need to understand reciprocity to understand what that field isn't.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. That you talked about making predictions, right? You falsify in that process, right? And then whatever predictions survive, right? There's going to be a set of predictions that survive, and you work back from that set of predictions till you find the first commonality, and that's the decision point right there. It's not you're not deciding about any of the predictions. You're just deciding on the first commonality point for that surviving set of predictions. So, yeah, I don't know. We don't teach full accounting early enough or often enough. So.
Well, I mean, but one of the things one of the things I focus on is checklists that cover every dimension.
Right.
Right. And so we give people the checklist because how do they know what full accounting looks like right? It's like we expect too much from people. We really do. It's just the world is only simple because we work so hard to simplify it.
The world expects more from them than we do, meaning that the world is asking for them to participate when they are unable and unfit, and participating harms them in the long run. We're asking for less. Focus on yourselves before you're pushed into the spheres of participation with others at the civilization level, at the level of politics, at the level of violence, at the level of decision-making for businesses.
Well, that's true if they don't feel alienated and insecure. And the problem is they do.
I know. Well, keep feeding them TikTok.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Well, how about we fix the economy? How about we put on the walls of the press room all the basic Western strategy, our constitutional strategy, and the post-war strategy, and explain it. and tie everything back to it. And then we make a bunch of equivalents of Schoolhouse Rock. We make 100 of those fucking things and saturate the airwaves with them so people understand the world. And then we say, this is what we're trying to get to over the next 10, 20, 50, and 100 years, right? And lay that out for people so they don't feel lost. But, as Americans, we don't make plans. We take advantage of the fact that we're hyper reactive, more reactive than any other civilization possible in history. And we take advantage of that by not fucking planning. It just makes people nuts. It's not fair to people, So, I mean, we don't have the long-term plan. And the reason we don't have the long-term plan is because left won't let us. The left won't let us have a long-term plan because it would expose their strategy. And it would allow us to say, are we trying to meet this goal? So, I mean, it's like having the law as a science and the long-term plan is what we're going to pursue. How long have we been chatting?
I don't know. They want to follow the science. Just let them.
Help. I know there's sarcasm in there, but I didn't get it.
You didn't get all the follow the science stuff when they were trying to get people to take the vaccines and all. Just follow the science. Just believe all that. Let's just do that.
What is this with Sam Harris out trying to legitimize, listen to authority? This guy is like, he's like jumped off the crazy bridge.
Well, he's not American, I can tell you that.
Well, he explained it. If the reality was different than it was, the authority would have been correct.
Yes. God. It's like I'd love to. He'd never do it because I'm nobody, but I'd love to debate him on that topic because he's just so fucking far off. Like yes, one of the things in life tells you if people who are generally herd followers are herding towards something, it's wrong, right? And we can, right? If you sound like you don't know what you're talking about, right? Then you probably don't. So, I mean, having these guys come out and I'm like, I swear to God, guys, that first report that came out of New Zealand or Australia, whatever it was, they first sequenced the gene. And I'm looking at that and I'm like, I don't think anything improved after that first one. In other words, the first report was about all the information we ever needed. And if you pull down you just go up there, just go on a Google Scholar and search for all the papers or archive for that matter. Right? Search for everything on COVID. It's fucking ridiculous, right? How many of those papers are anything other than grant searches? And they're nonsense. We had the greatest test run at scale, right? I mean, the thing infected most of the fucking planet. We had statistics on who had infected and what kind of, they came up with a therapy for it, like in 90 days, right? What do we, where's all this, you got to take it from, why? Because they don't want to say the truth that it'll just kill old people because it's electorally and electorally hazardous to say that, or people with prior illnesses. Sam Harris, what a fucking clown. I really liked the guy originally. I mean, he is what he says he was, but I mean, he is what he appears to be. But I originally thought the guy was doing a pretty good job. But he's out there doubling down again. And that and his Trump derangement syndrome is it's just the most feminine reaction you could possibly have.
Well, I mean, think of Fox Day what you will, but in his first book, Irrational Atheist, he exposes Sam Harris, among other people, for liars that they have always been.
Can you say that again? In his first book?
Irrational Atheist, he exposes Harris as well as Hitchin and Dawkins about how they lied about religion all along. In fact, New Atheism is a branch of Abrahamism, so they would never say that.
Yes. Well, I don't know if I've heard Dawkins lately. he would say, well, I mean, if we discovered that these values were valuable, that's different from if we discovered them by weird means or religious means, that's okay. All right. The question is, we don't have to teach the other stuff. I think that's what he would take the position on. I remember when I first read he and Gould, I was like, I think Gould's right here. And then I spent looking, wait a minute, no, it's wrong. And it came out that Gould was wrong about everything.
Oh, he was lying.
Yes.
He must have known he was lying.
Yeah, it's not that he was wrong, it's that he was lying, right? But that's the problem with magical thinking. They think do they know they're lying? Or can they not tell the difference? It's like you must believe them. Believe them why? We have like 6,000 years of history of why you don't believe them. Because they think magical's nonsense and they can't tell the difference. So did Gould know he was a liar?
I mean, there was that study where he completely fabricated skull
Yes,
size.
exactly.
Could
Yes, he knew he was lying. But it's like, so did the Frankfurt School guys know they were lying? Well, they said it. Well, I can't remember which one of them said it afterwards. We just made it up. They're not scientists, they're philosophers. What's science? Testimony. What's philosophy? Fantasy moral literature.
Justification.
Justification.
That's with the heritage. When you confront the risk averse with a threat, they're going to avoid. They're going to take whatever path of avoidance they can. That's how their aversion manifests.
Yes.
If that means they can shunt everything off to some big government or authority, then they're going to do that to avoid as their mechanism of aversion. I mean, it's a very rational response given their risk aversion, their level of risk aversion.
Mm-hmm. Now, can I run over that? Can I run over that for a second? Is that all right?
Yep.
Yeah. So we have already talked about how men defer to women or males defer to females. Pander is the right word, I guess. And we know that females feel weaker, right, or more vulnerable, and we know that they have higher neuroticism. So we know that all those are true. So we also know that women seek special privilege, special pleadings at all times, right? They seek to avoid responsibility and special pleadings. They double down when they're wrong, and they don't admit failure, and they double down instead. So, those are all defensive reactions, right? They're not, if you take the human being out of it and consider it a bot, those are the natural sequence of defensive reactions. So, but are they aware, or is the female mind aware of that it's doing that? In other words, do they feel they're being moral when they're asking for special pleading? And I'm asking this because we have so much testimony now in the course of in video that it looks like they can't comprehend. It's well, Luke's gonna come back and say, well, they're just children. Okay, so because that's the right answer. But I mean, why is it that they can't comprehend it?
But they don't have some independent sense of morality like we do. They just accept society's values, and if society allows them to look moral while evading our responsibility, That's what's gonna attract them.
We're
It's
also
gonna allow them special pleading. While looking moral, they're going to do
I
that.
think it's just continued childhood, isn't it?
we're hypersocial. We're hypersocial creatures, cooperative creatures. Everyone is always seeking other people's favor. They don't want, they're always special pleading on their behalf so that you're not in a conflict with them. There has to be people who are willing to have the conflicts to get to resolutions.
They always take the submissive position. And
We
they
are-
also always take the victim position.
We're trying to explain to people that we need people who understand how to submit to the law, and that's it. Those are your soft.
I know that.
self-determined.
Sorry, I'm sorry to pull you back. Is that we're trying, why is it that women behave this way?
When they're under stress, they will default to seeking favor, special pleading, instead of cooperating, meaning finding a place to add value and trade.
So it's the submission response.
It's a evasion response.
Right, of course.
That-
Well, I mean,
right.
but that's what you do, right? That's what all humans do, right? If you get even a tough guy in a very position, it's like, please, please, no, 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 right? That happens to I'll do anything, right? We all do that, right? So there's not a,
I say it's the default, but men are much more easier to retrain from it, and they usually can get away without being restrained from it. Get away with stuff.
oh, why?
Because the world just isn't going to reward men for evading responsibility,
We're not. gonna-
whereas women have inherent value.
Mhm. Okay, that's the right answer. So the answer is their presumption of inherent value. So doesn't a child have a presumption of inherent value?
If
Yes.
we're raised
We
in a-
don't, we don't think of it that way, but that's the problem, right?
So the
We call it selfishness, but it's presumption of inherent
Right.
value.
entitlement, maybe. The thinking I've been looking at lately, just to try to wrap my head around this particular problem, is so male responsibility takes the form of conversion of nature into value. into
Yes,
commons capital or intergenerational value or whatever. That's male responsibility, right? Or masculine responsibility, the male form of responsibility. The feminine form of responsibility is the conversion of the consumption of that value into reproduction, into the expression of intergenerational value, the passing it on to the next generation, right? That side of it, right? So it's male responsibility is production, female responsibility is consumption, but it has to be directed towards that intergenerationality, right? Both of them have to be directed towards that intergenerationality. That's what responsibility into the commons looks like for the masculine and the feminine. Right? So what happens when
capitalization and reproduction.
right, capitalization, reproduction. So what happens when we displace or outsource or remove that the mechanisms of reproduction, of even the potential for the expression of that feminine value when the kids aren't in the house, when the people aren't involved in the community, there's no family, there's no community, there's no raising of children. How is responsibility even possible? How is the feminine forms of responsibility even possible? How is the expression of the feminine form of responsibility even possible?
They aren't.
So I completely agree that the feminine mind avoids masculine responsibility, but in the same way, the masculine mind avoids feminine responsibility.
Right.
We're not doing the care, reproduction stuff. I mean,
absolutely.
right. So it's
I try to correct myself when I do that, but I don't succeed. So
Right.
you're right. I call it irresponsibility, but what I mean is irresponsibility for capitalization of the commons.
right. Yes, yeah, absolutely. But that's why I lean into the childishness stuff so hard, is because we've created a situation where the only option right now is childishness, because we've eliminated the structure where responsibility can exist. We don't have family, we don't have community, we don't have child rearing, because we
Yeah.
outsource all of those things, or we've destroyed all of those things.
Yeah,
So the containers that allow for feminine forms of responsibility just aren't accessible right now.
that's correct. So I usually,
So of course, we're not seeing female responsibility being expressed.
so how do we take it from this point? So the female mind, wow, it's really weird. I just have no I have no long-term, medium-term memory this morning. If we take it from women who are, how did you just say it, Luke? It's not, we've to remove responsibility from them. How did you just say it now? Why are there's no responsibility left for them to take, right?
Right. We've removed the access points, the demonstration points for where their responsibility, their form, where the feminine form of responsibility can be expressed.
Okay, so if we start with under female maturity, the female's nervous system, which is empathizing, is exaggerated, just as the male for systematizing is. And this exaggerated so that her nervous system can account for by empathizing with her offspring.
Yeah.
Right? And you notice more stable women have had younger brothers and sisters. You've noticed that.
Right.
So who they had some responsibility for.
Yes.
So if we start out with that premise that we've exerted their nervous system for empathizing, or does that explain the how does that result in the behavior you just described? Because they are managing responsibility.
They have the same problem with compassion as males have with aggression. It needs to be redirected to the commons.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, that's why I also claim or assert that child rearing is a maturation pressure.
Of course, exactly.
So that early exposure is necessary, and that's why, you know, one of the reasons why
Right. So
tribes work and stuff
so
like
what's
that.
happening? I'm just trying. So because the way I explained what you explained, Luke, is that that's like our dominance expression. It has to be put somewhere,
Right.
And it can go a good place or a bad, right?
Right. Yes.
Their means of dominance expression is empathizing, right? Which is basically manipulation, and they want that manipulation to be exercised. They want attention, and they want a manipulation. That's the same thing as us doing things in the physical world, other men, capital do it.
Right.
And so if it doesn't get exercised, then it gets redirected to the self instead of the commons.
Mhm.
And if it is directed to the commons, it gets directed mistakenly toward the commons. Like, in other words, we need to treat the public as children I don't have, right? Instead of, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Or we get cat ladies.
Mhm.
So does that one difference explain? That's all you need is the prey bias, or neuroticism, fear bias, and empathizing, which is prediction of others, and the desire to exercise that instinct, which we call attention seeking, and we'll call it manipulation, but it's a influence, right? That's what they want. That's, you see these girls, they're young girls, they're out there and they like all these bad guys. Why? Because it's a manipulation game. They like playing the manipulation game. What?
Status and influence.
Right. And
Status is masculine, the influence is feminine.
Right. And so the problem, of course, is that we both have that energy, that energetic activism, so that it can be directed toward production of commons, which in the female sense is children, and in the male sense is capital, right? Different, common capital. And so the problem is, so what I'm trying to get at is that one change, that sequence, enough to explain the behavior? In other words, it's, of course they're being, if you can't direct your mind to your instincts to child rearing, which is what they're for, where are you going to put it? Right, I mean, it's not, the brain basically will drive us mad if we don't give it something to do. So,
And I believe we're witnessing the same thing happening to males now as they're being separated from their ability to convert nature into production, into the
Correct.
commons, right?
Correct.
So as they're losing their mechanisms for the expression of responsibility, we're seeing the childishness emerge in the males, just like we've seen the childishness emerge in females as they've lost their access to mechanisms where they can express responsibility.
okay, so you're not, what I didn't get out of you is no. That's not the set of, in other words, I think we understand the first principles of
Yep.
their behavior, right?
Yep.
Is that,
I agree, yes.
all right, okay. So, and the whole point is are like any resource, are empathizing or systematizing, our desire for social capital, which is interpersonal manipulation, or political capital, which is physical or political manipulation. Right? Those two things are the means by which we get reward and status, right? Which is our reproductive strategy. So I mean, that's all we have to have, right? We don't need any more explanation than that to talk about male and female origins. And most importantly, which is what we emphasize, isn't this, we're not looking for ideals anymore, right? That's what people got into problems in the past. We're looking to falsify the bad things. So if we say this is a resource that can be put to good or ill, and how do we direct it to good rather than ill, right? And in the past, they just tried to constrain it. But the way you did, of course, the way they directed both parties was the production of families, right? So that's the optimum possible exchange between the sexes, is the production of family. I mean, because you basically have your own tribe, right? Am I missing something, Luke? I'm trying to give you.
No, absolutely. The only thing I add to that is that prior to the technology of civilization as we understand it now, nature would kill you if you were expressing it inappropriately or incorrectly, right? Nature would destroy the tribe or the group or the individuals that weren't.
Well, if you did it at scale, but I mean, it's pretty hard to misapply our instincts in a tribe of 40 to 100 people. Because
right,
it's almost impossible. Because
right.
first of all, you don't have the time to. I mean, there's too many demands for your labors, your attention and labors, right, in that group, and you don't have the time and extra resources not to.
Well, the feedback is too immediate.
Yes.
Right. So as we expand the technology of civilization, we increase the time period of that feedback. Right, so you're not getting that correction. So we're making more room for the suboptimal to exist. So that's what we have to accommodate for. That's what we have to account for in law and policy and norms and things like that. So yeah, absolutely. That's all we're trying to do. We're just trying to be gentler than nature.
Man, though, once the children get it's what you have a bunch of spoiled children. What do you do? Because now you got to produce a whole new generation of unspoiled children.
Yeah.
What do you think, Jacob? You're sitting there diligently listening and watching, and I'm sitting here. I gotta tease Jacob, see if I can get anything out of him. But usually you just watch. So.
Yeah, well, I think Luke laid a few explosives there. I'm gonna have to work with those for a while.
All right.
We just need all of our guys having more kids, right? That's that next generation of responsible children.
What we need is enough of us. We need a generation to produce enough of us to hold a Supreme Court is what we need. Right. Anyway. All right. Anything anybody else got? That was a great discussion. Trying to think of anything else I can push. I don't think Jordan Hall will still talk to me, will he? He won't talk to me yet.
I can ask him.
Would need to.
In private, presumably.
What?
In private, presumably.
Yeah. Is he the one, who's the one behind the group that shut down last fall? Radical. They were, oh, God. I can't believe I've forgotten them already.
I know who you mean, and I also can remember the name.
The guys who were doing a sort of center left dark web type thing, Radical Agenda or
Rebel Wisdom.
Rebel Wisdom. Who are
David
the
Fuller.
what?
You're talking about David Fuller.
David Fuller. How's David Fuller doing? Do you know?
I have no idea.
I'd like to talk to him because I'm kind of disappointed
I'm pretty sure he has a distaste for me.
I think it's really, you're like the least distasteful person. I don't really get it.
Maybe it says something about him.
Okay.
If he's got a distaste for you, he'd choke on the rest of us. So.
I always find that really weird. I think it's, the problem is we're emotionally non-responsive. And I think they just can't comprehend that too. Anyway. And then what's his name has gone off and he's running for office, Schellenberger?
Schellenberger.
Have you seen he's running for office?
I follow Schellenberger. I like it.
Schmachtenberger.
Schmachtenberger. Fuck. I don't know. One of those things. One of those German names.
Schmachtenberger's running for office.
Hmm?
Daniel Schmachtenberger, is he running for office?
I think it's California.
Really?
Or are we conflating multiple burgers?
Well, I heard Schellenberger and Schmachtenberger. Those are two different burgers. I know of both of them. They both do different
I
things.
can't believe I just did that.
So there could be more burgers in there for all I know.
Get them all running for office.
Yeah.
No, so it's Daniel and who's the other one? Schellenberger.
Michael.
Yeah.
Mike, right? Michael?
I think so.
Yeah, it's Michael I'm thinking of.
Michael, I follow on Twitter.
So he's running for office. I just can't figure out where is he running. I think it's California.
That sounds right.
He's a good guy. He wrote San Francisco.
Clever.
Huh?
I said clever.
Anyway. All right. Well, that's all I have for this week. And Martin and I'm going to handle Martin. We'll handle your money. All right. Jacob, anything? Can I mess with you a little bit?
Absolutely. Give me your best shot.
I won't work. You guys are all fucking stoned. As impermeable as stone. All right. I love you guys. Thank you for the great meeting. It was a great time.
Yeah, thank you guys. Got a lot of value.
Bye-bye.
All the love, guys.
See you next time.